Libya, The Infernal Trap, a documentary by Catherine Norris-Trent, Julie Dongeloff, and Abdallah Malkawi here on France 24, which you can also see on our website, france24.com. And we're joined by Catherine Norris-Trent, who filmed that just recently. Also with us, Jalal Harshawi, research fellow at the Conflict Research Unit of the Klingendale Institute. And from Washington, Frederick Worre, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the author of The Burning Shores, Inside the Battle for the New Libya. Thank you for joining us. Joined as well from Tunis by Tariq Argaz. He's the Libya spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Welcome to the show. Catherine, let me begin with you. Lots to talk about in that report that we saw, and that's again on our website, with the fighting on the front line. We'll talk about that later, what the military situation is inside of Libya right now. But let's begin with this humanitarian situation and this boat ride that you took. You, at the outset, state that it is Malta and Italy that alert the Libyan Coast Guard that there's this dinghy with migrants on board.
Right, and this is part of this coordination we've seen between some European countries and the Libyan authorities, including the Libyan Coast Guard. So there's a control room in Tripoli. I presume there are others down the Libyan coast where they get alerts coming in. This one was first, the alert was first sounded by Malta and then by Italy, saying there's this migrant boat, come and basically get it back. Obviously, part of that is to stop people drowning, because you saw how many people were packed into that dinghy, and the dinghies are in often terrible condition. Sometimes the Libyan Coast Guard tell us they get there and it's too late. There are just dead bodies floating on the water. Sometimes they find nothing. Sometimes they find boats that are about to sink. But there's also a part of this, which is the EU is some states feeling inundated with migrants, and they want them not to arrive on European shores. And this is part of the solution, to fund the Libyan Coast Guard. Those crew, they were trained by Italy. That boat was an Italian vessel. It's part of an effort to beef up the Libyan Coast Guard, so they bring migrants back to Libya, which clearly, as we saw, is an active conflict zone.
At one point, we see in the report a man in uniform, I don't know whether it's a Coast Guard official or a policeman. He says, he turns to the camera and says, what's the solution?
Absolutely. Now, he was a member of the Libyan Port Police, but you're right, there's an awful lot of actors, and at times we don't know who's there. There are members of the Coast Guard, members of the police, people we found out later who were coordinating with another armed group who ran a detention centre. So it's a very confusing situation, first of all, on the ground, which is one of the problems, I think, for trying to help the situation. And he says, yeah, that for him, there's no solution, that he sees this every day. At the time we were filming, which was late October, we filmed that boat ride. The Libyan Coast Guard group said this was happening every day, that he personally had seen 500 people, brought them back on his boat. And this is just one boat in the Tripoli flotilla. And there are other Coast Guard crews active right along the coast there in the west. And so the numbers were absolutely huge.
Jalal Harshawi, what strikes you when you watch that report?
Well, it seems that the model that was instituted by Italy, really, it was more Italy that took the lead in 2017. It took a certain amount of measures, and the Coast Guard is the aspect of its policy back then that kind of worked. It really did work. The statistics have fallen since 2017. Right now, the number of arrivals into Sicily via Libya, just roughly, it's always every month less than 1,000. In 2016, it was roughly 15,000 per month. So from an EU perspective or from an Italian perspective, the whole thing worked. And then all the consequences inside Libya, well, that's a separate issue that is not considered really the Europeans' problem at this stage.
Now, you say it's Italy, but it's all of Europe that backs this, as Catherine was mentioning. Public opinion here in France, some 2/3 of the French think, yeah, just keep them away from our shores.
Well, France is not really affected anyway. It's true that the opinion is anti. The opinion in Italy is even more anti-migrants. But the statistics, as I said, are clearly zero at this stage.
All right. Frederick Worre, when you see the situation, is there another way? Is there another solution?
Well, as your other guest mentioned, it is working, but at what moral cost? I mean, I've been inside these detention centers, and they're a living hell. I mean, it runs the gamut, of course, from slavery, rape, sexual abuses. Now, with the war, they're being endangered further. Of course, what's the solution? It's bigger than anything the Libyans can manage, anything than the international community can manage. Now, in Libya, it requires actions by African states, a revision of EU entry policies. I mean, the first step, the first solution is stopping this war, because the migrants' lives have been endangered further because these detention centers are in the conflict zone. They've been hit by airstrikes. The militias, of course, are trying to conscript them into militia workshops and endangering them further.
Endangering them further, the fact that the civil war has come to the gates of the capital, adding yet another layer of Frederick worry.
That's correct. I mean, of course, as I mentioned, the conditions were already deplorable, and there was massive violence against these migrant centers. But now, of course, with the conflict, those militias, some of them have been, moved to the front. Of course, their secondary concern is caring and feeding for these migrants, and they're putting them in harm's way. So again, I was in the war zone. I saw the aftermath of an airstrike where there were some migrant workers killed in a factory. So again, there's the front line between civilian areas and the combat zone has been blurred, and that's of course impacting these vulnerable migrants.
Tariq Argaz, are you surprised at, well, how little attention it's all been getting since April?
Well, since April, we have had a lot of things going on, including, for instance, the displacement of over 130,000 Libyan families from Tripoli to other neighbors or outside of Tripoli. It has also affected the refugees and asylum seekers that are inside the country, the ones that are in detention centers, because most of detention centers have been very close to conflict areas, but also the over 40,000 refugees and asylum seekers that are living in urban areas in Libya.
And can you confirm from what's in that report that that was a quote-unquote good detention center, that there's much worse?
Say that again, excuse me?
The detention center that Catherine and her crew visited is actually one of the better ones.
I mean, I don't know if we can talk about better ones or worse ones. The conditions in detention, we definitely know that are very dire. For us, refugees should not be detained in the first place, because a refugee is a person that has been forced to flee its own country, fleeing persecution or a war, and this person is seeking international protection, so it should not be penalized or detained.
The Guardian newspaper on November 27th published a report that said some 400 refugees who came from the Abu Salim detention center in the south of the country had apparently, quote, been without food for weeks. The Guardian adding that the UNHCR was planning to withdraw food from 600 other refugees and migrants in the center, to include survivors of bombings, torture, forced labor, and human rights abuses. What's your reaction to that report?
Well, that's not the case. The center they are talking about, what we call the gathering and departure facility, is a center that had been created as an alternative to detention and as a transit center for refugees that are prioritized for resettlement, meaning for solutions out of Libya. So the purpose of the center is to host refugees for a short period of time before we can evacuate them out of Libya. The current situation is that the center is overcrowded. We have more than 1,000 persons inside the center, and we cannot provide assistance up to the standards we used to provide. That's why we have expanded our assistance in urban areas. We are providing an urban assistance that includes cash assistance, winter clothes, sleeping mats, blankets, and other kind of assistance to all the persons that wish to depart from the center and join their communities in the city.
Catherine Rostrand.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because clearly I think it's the UNHCR are clearly trying as best they can on the ground, as many international organizations are, and access is extremely tricky. I mean, the power centers in Libya are very fragmented. It's a conflict zone. But I guess I just wanted to ask, Tariq, do you feel that the UN is overwhelmed by the situation in Libya? I mean, what else do you need? What do you need international states? What do you need people to do to help this situation?
I mean, the situation is far from being ideal. You have been in the country and you saw that security is definitely a challenge. I mean, this is affecting not only people on the ground and civilians, but also humanitarian workers. Most of the times we are unable to access several places to assist persons in need, and not only in the city, but also outside. So definitely the situation is very, very dire. And I guess that the solution is to put an end to this war so that we can have a better intervention and access all people that are in need of assistance.
Let's talk about more the fact that this is all happening on Europe's doorstep. The new vice president of the European Commission, Margaritis Schinas, who's, by the way, his official portfolio is commissioner in charge of promoting our European way of life. He spoke to France 24's Luke Brown.
No one is happy or proud with the situation that exists in Libya. Libya is a state which is in the chaos of a civil war. There is no reliable interlocutor, so the situation in the camps is far from satisfactory. It's dramatic, it's unacceptable, but it is not the European Union that manages these camps. It's the authorities there, of whatever is left of the government authorities. The Libyan sea zone is 200 miles. It's a vast area in which Europeans cannot go there. It's for the Libyans to organize their operations. So I think that it is not fair to blame the European Union on a situation that is much more complex and much more complicated because of the ongoing chaos of the Libyan civil war.
Jalal Hashawi, your reaction?
Well, I'm not interested in blaming the EU. I think what I care the most about is optics. For example, like the issue of having a war zone, a difficulty of access. And even before the April war, there were a lot of areas with multiple detention centers with no access. Like right now, there's the city of Bani Walid, which is almost completely on the side of Marshal Haftar. Well, you have at least 10 to 15 detention centers, each one harboring somewhere between 500 and 1,000 migrants, and the conditions there are awful as well. So it's easy to focus on Tripoli because it happens to be the government of national accord, which continues to enjoy international recognition. So all the pressure is on it. It's under siege by the war, and on top of it, we are kind of
so it's both sides.
What I'm saying is that there's a lot of information gaps, and the accountability pressure is exerted only on one government, not the other one.
And that is absolutely correct, because they are allowing journalists to come in and try and work there, whereas on the Haftar side, there's no foreign journalists been allowed to go in and meaningfully do reporting. So there's an information blackout. Obviously, there's all kinds of reports about different things going on, which are really impossible to verify. So that there is definitely some truth to that, in that we can get into Western Libya, we can get into Tripoli, we can have a look around, and there are things that are extremely shocking, but we just don't know. There are huge blackouts of information. Notably, I was talking to people on the ground about what's happening in Bani Walid, and concerns about eastern and southern Libya, really appalling situation there, and it's just so difficult to access.
Jalal Hashawi, the difficulty, though, when you listen to the European Commission Vice President, is that on the one hand, he recognizes that here you have a situation where a very weak state, some might call it a failed state, you know, and obviously you have dueling governments at this point. And on the other hand, saying, well, it's not our responsibility, it's the responsibility of Libya. So what do you do in your Europe?
Well, it's interesting because he says there are two failed states, but there's one that is gaining more and more favor internationally speaking. So if you watch the EU attitude of the next several months, it's not going to remain static. There's a lot of political changes happening, and it's important to kind of watch this and also see the difference between the behavior in the water versus on land. On land, it's a big question mark. We don't know anything. It's completely opaque, and as a result, it's the Libyans' problems. But in the water, information is available. The dinghies are monitored, immediately located, and so on and so forth. So you're right. It's a very complicated discourse which hides a certain amount of hypocrisy.
Frederick Worry, what should the European Union be doing?
Well, first, I'm not ready to absolve the European Union so easily. I mean, their culpability in this stems back to 2011 in terms of the aftermath of the overthrow of Gaddafi and I believe, not doing enough in the aftermath. Look, the European Union has been incredibly divided toward Libya. They've pursued their own self-serving agendas, France and Italy, and Libyan militias, Libyan political elites on the ground have been very adept at exploiting that. Of course, there are some European states that back Khalifa Haftar that I think tacitly approved of and supported his operation on April 4th. So the Europeans do bear a great deal of responsibility for this. And on the migrant issue, these militias know that stopping the migrants is a huge issue for Europe. And so they're positioning themselves as partners, for the European Union. And as we heard, Italy was directly responsible for this policy of basically subcontracting a containment policy to these Libyan militias that empowers them. So the fragmentation of Libya, of course, it stems back decades, and there are multiple socioeconomic and political reasons, but I do think outside powers, including the Europeans, have a responsibility for it.
All right, we're getting to the issue of what the state of play is right now inside of Libya. It was back in April, again, that nationalist leader Khalifa Haftar broke with a UN compromise that was in the works and launched his offensive on the capital. It's not gone to plan yet, as both sides seem bogged down. 1,000 killed, 120,000 displaced. The front line is static, but still, and you witnessed it, Catherine, yourself, right on the outskirts of Tripoli, that's where you filmed that fighting.
Right, exactly. There's a place there where the front line gets really close to the capital city.
Can you maybe show us here on this map?
The point at the top that's nearest to Tripoli is at some point, I would say around 10 kilometers from the center. So you're still in a semi-urban environment. The fighting, as you saw, is taking place in this kind of very surreal atmosphere between these abandoned homes. You've got fighters climbing up, children's toys and slides in the garden. You could steal people's possessions when they've fled and run. They've just left all their things there, from house to house. It's just it's a devastating scene, really. And yeah, it's been stagnating for a long time because of the match in powers, because of foreign.
In the middle, you follow this militia leader, Mohsen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who was an engineering student?
He was an engineering student, and then he told us he took up arms in 2011 to fight in the revolution to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, and that's basically become his life ever since. And we chose to kind of present his portrait because it's my trips to Libya over the years, there are so many people like that, so many young men, and the war, the fighting, the various combats in Libya, the turmoil has become their life. And a lot of them say to us, I'd really like to return to civilian life. We saw his family business there where he told us, that's what he would like to be doing with his brothers, but he's carried on fighting. Our report's entitled The Libyan Trap. It's a trap for migrants, but it's a trap for many Libyans as well, because there's this cycle of chaos and violence, and it seems the country can't get out of that. There are so many ways in which it just seems that there's no way to break that. There are these stocks of arms held by the brigades who don't want to give them up to a central state. They say they don't trust them, they don't recognize them. They're worried about living under a new military dictatorship. And so you've got this very fragmented power base, and it's quite difficult to see how that can be stopped.
Frederick Worry, when you look at Mohsen in that report, he's got his, what is it, a hardware store? A hardware store on the one hand, and on the other hand, he's a militia leader. Does he really have an incentive at some point to give back his gun?
Well, many of them do. I mean, they tell me they want to return to their normal life. Of course, the militias have their own sort of self-generating logic, and we've been in this spiral, this trap, as your filmmaker noted, for over 7 years now. And I mean, let me congratulate the filmmakers on a very visceral and humane depiction of just the exhaustion of war. I mean, fighters like this commander have been embroiled in successive conflicts. And I think for some of them, serving in a militia, they don't have another option. And the problem is the state is paying these militias, so there's a financial incentive for them to keep, going. But for others, they do want to return. I mean, they want a better future, but they are tremendously concerned about what's happening now in the political, future of this country. So to say that they're simply driven by money or power, many of them genuinely believe that they're defending a civil state.
Defending a civil state. Do you agree with that, Jalal Hashawi?
I agreed with everything that has been said, except this notion of a stalemate. It is true that the line visually, when you depict it this way, it has looked roughly the same. But I was in Zara just 4 months ago, and the psychology was completely different. The morale level was different. The amount of civilian loss of life and destruction was much lower than now. So the war keeps changing, and I don't think we should use the word
Who's
stalemate.
got the momentum?
Haftar. Haftar has been able to raise the bar in terms of acceptance of civilian deaths and displacement, targeting soft infrastructure, soft targets, and it has been paying off because the morale of the other side has been tanking. So it's really a picture that it keeps moving, and I don't think we should call it static.
Yeah, I think that's correct. There's been an intensification of this conflict since the late summer, the increasing use of drones, and it is proving tough. We were talking about Mohsen, our brigade leader that we were following. Well, he's recently been injured now and in a hospital, and he told us he'd lost quite a lot of his men, and it is feeling like there is some momentum, and they're very frustrated as well. They say that they see the impact of these drones, which they say are flown by foreign allies of Haftar, the UAE and Egypt, and that the world is just letting that happen. And of course, and it's a very complex proxy war, but from the side we were able to access there in Tripoli. In Misrata, actually, we were able to film the remains of a drone which was presented to us as a UAE drone, which was shot down. Now, we didn't put this in the report because we're still actually trying to verify exactly what kind it is, and we didn't want to put any erroneous information in there, but we're continuing on this investigation. But the use of these combat drones, this air power, has really changed the conflict.
Really changed the conflict? Frederick Worry, is everybody trying out their toys in Libya?
Absolutely, and I agree with what was said. I was on the front lines in late November, and the momentum has absolutely turned in Haftar's favor because of the injection of technological weaponry, much of it brought by the arrival of over 100 mercenaries, Russian mercenaries in early September, but also the persistent use of drones. So again, this is a very high-tech war that's really, I think, grinding down the morale of the GNA fighters. They just can't find sanctuary. They can't drive their vehicles. They're hunkering down for hours on end. Mortars are being rained down on them. Some of them told me they're leaving the front to go home. So it's really taking a toll. Now, Haftar still has a long way to go in terms of moving his forces into these densely populated urban areas, downtown Tripoli. But for the first time, I could possibly see him taking Tripoli, and the consequences of that are quite worrying.
You mentioned those Russian mercenaries. Have they really tipped the scales? How many of them are there?
The credible estimates I've seen is somewhere in the high hundreds. This is from multiple institutions, international organizations. They absolutely have. I mean, they're bringing with them laser-guided artillery. They're bringing snipers. GNA fighters tell me the entire, the precision of what the LNA is throwing at them has just increased, has improved, right? And there are reports recently that the Russians may actually be directing LNA forces on the battlefield in terms of maneuvering. So they are bringing a qualitative edge to Haftar's forces, and I think it's a psychological impact. Again, speaking to the commanders, their casualties have increased and their morale has really plummeted.
And why are the Russians getting involved?
The Russians have had a long-standing interest in Libya going back to the days of Muammar Gaddafi in terms of arms contracts, energy. But I think they're driven really by opportunism. They see disarray, they see, you know, a failed Western attempt to put this state back together. They do have some ties to Khalifa Haftar, even though he lived in the United States for decades. He was trained in the Soviet Union. I think his vision for Libya accords with their vision for an authoritarian order in the Middle East. He's a strong man. So they're backing him now. It doesn't mean they've embraced him 100%, that he's their man in Tripoli. But as one U.S. official said, the Russians are, you know, they're putting their finger on the scales and they're tipping this battle in Haftar's favor.
And what's the reaction right now in Washington?
There's alarm in many quarters, I think, but the question is, so what? And, you know, how does Washington respond? Is Washington going to go head to toe with the Russians? Is Libya worth fighting the Russians over? I don't think so, and definitely not. But I think that it's injected a new sense of urgency in Congress and other quarters to ending this war. And of course, what I've argued is the Russian interference is just one piece of it. You've got, of course, the Emiratis flying drones, and they are launching missiles onto civilian targets. I actually was able to corroborate the remnants of a missile that was fired from an Emirati drone on a factory that killed civilians. So the Emiratis have a big role in this. But of course, it's Russia that's really getting the attention of the United States right now.
Tariq Argaz, you heard Catherine Norris-Trent earlier saying how Western journalists are having a hard time getting to that side of the front. Are humanitarian aid organizations like yours able to work in areas controlled by Khalifa Haftar?
We do have a presence in the east, and we have been distributing assistance both in detention centers run by the authorities, as well as different settlements where internally displaced Libyan families are living currently. So we do have a presence, and we can operate always or most of the time through local partners. So we have these partnerships with local NGOs or people that are already on the ground, and this way we can better organize ourselves and do the distribution specifically to all the persons that are in need, maybe in the detention centers, as I mentioned, or in settlements of internally displaced.
And can you confirm what Jalal Harshari was saying a short while ago? That is that over the last couple of months, there's been an intensification. Is it harder for you to work on both sides?
I mean, it has been difficult since day one. It's been 8 months that this conflict is ongoing. We had our main objective is to assist all the persons vulnerable, may it be refugees, asylum seekers, or internally displaced. So we have been on all fronts. We have been evacuating people from different detention centers that were literally in the conflict zones. We took several hundreds to our center, the center we mentioned earlier, the Gathering and Departure Facility. We have evacuated out of Libya only this year more than 2,000 asylum seekers and refugees to safer places, may it be to our centers in other countries or resettled directly to European countries. And we are still working. It's true that the situation is very, very complicated. It's very challenging, but we are committed to stay in Libya and keep assisting the most vulnerable persons.
Can't be easy, Catherine Norris-Trent, when you've had a UN envoy who was, again, shuttling back and forth, trying to get these competing governments, these dueling governments, to sit down. There was talk of some kind of an agreement being fleshed out, and then it all kicks off in April.
Well, yeah, I think the staff of Hassan Salami and he himself are extremely frustrated by the situation. They're being criticised by a lot of people in Tripoli that we saw as being inactive and not doing anything. A lot of people understandably very upset and frustrated with the situation in general and looking to the international community to do much more. And there is supposed to be this conference coming, the Berlin conference, to try and find some way forward. Now, whether it's actually going to provide any kind of solution, who knows? I mean, the Libyan problem, the puzzle is just one of the most complicated, I think, internationally to find any solution to. The Libyan actors not attending, not being invited. So it's the international community trying to work out what they want to do. Now, whether they can actually agree on what to do is a huge question, because if you've got, you know, Russia on one side, the US on the other, I mean, are they going to agree on a common purpose?
And we've seen in 2019, there were other conferences, Jalal Harshawi, in 2018 as well, in Paris, in Rome.
Palermo, yeah.
How did those go?
Well, Berlin is trying to be different. And it's trying to approach it as a simple issue. I mean, back in late August, we heard about Angela Merkel's initiative, and the idea was very healthy and very simple. It was to stop, to try and cool off the foreign interventions. And I don't think it's very complicated. Turkey was intervening on one side to name the main state, and the other side, you have the Emirates. By the way, the Emirates are not just running drones, they're also using fighter jets to bomb, like fighter jets with pilots. And the idea was to try to slow them down.
And is this just to be clear, is this that fight that's going on between countries that are close to the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, Turkey on the one hand, and those that are dead set against them, like Egypt and the Emirates?
Yeah, it's one facet, absolutely. But the idea was to kind of bring this up and discuss it. Well, that discussion hasn't happened. It has happened on the Turkish side, and the Turkish intervention is still smaller compared to the Emirati one. And nobody has been able to even mention this notion that maybe the Emiratis should cool off. And so the Berlin format has not succeeded. And one reason is that France has used its diplomatic muscles to make sure that nobody criticizes the Emirati mission in Libya.
Why?
Because...
What's in it for France?
It agrees, I mean, it doesn't want to hurt or alienate a Sunni Arab state that is perceived as the ideal ally. France is aware that the United States is exiting the Middle East, North Africa region over the long run. And in that scope, in that new context, it would love to work with someone like the Emiratis. They agree on the ideology. They love the economic dynamism of the Emiratis. And there's no question, there's no desire to alienate them or to anger them in any way. So there's an agreement.
And that's why you're saying that they're, well, boosting the profile of Khalifa Haftar by inviting him to Paris.
France would see a Haftar victory as the emergence of a pro-France Libya. And that's a dream that has been going on in Paris for decades.
Is that how you read it, Frederick Worry?
Yes, to a large extent. I mean, France has been a key enabler of Khalifa Haftar's operations, not just in Tripoli, but in Benghazi several years ago, in terms of, I think, quite frankly, a very double-faced policy where on the one hand they've paid lip service to this UN-brokered process while secretly supporting Khalifa Haftar with advisors and support. So it's part of a broader, I think, regional strategy. They're attracted to his quite frankly, strongman version of politics, the economic dimension, France's ties with the Emirates, all factor into this. I would just want to add that I think the Islamist angle of this has been completely overblown and inflated by the Emirates. So the Islamist, question or resolving the Islamist issue as a way to get this conflict stopped, it's not going to work. I mean, this is about broader self-interested politics. There's an economic dimension. And I think, quite frankly, also a product of the American vacuum here, the American ambivalence. And when you talk to Libyans, they genuinely believe that more American pressure could end this conflict. I'm not completely sold on this, but certainly more American pressure on the Emirates could move us in the right direction.
Catherine Norris-Trent, did you sense that you were in Islamist territory when you were in Tripoli?
No, I mean, it's a conservative country, and you have to respect that. And but in Tripoli, you still see women out in cafes drinking, and me and a female colleague, as well as Abdullah Malkawi, our male colleague, Julie Dunkelhoff and I, we went around filming this report, and it wasn't a barrier to us. You know, we were there with the militias. They were talking to us. And in fact, that's one of the things that really annoyed them, as we saw in that report. Mohsen and his men really hate the fact that they are being called Islamists by Haftar. It's one thing, if you mention it, it makes their blood boil, because they say, look, we from Misrata, we fought against Daesh, the Islamic State group, with their foothold in Libya in Sirte, and now we're being called Islamists. And it's just one of the many complexities of this conflict.
Can I add another layer of complexity?
Please go ahead.
The expulsion of the Libyan ambassador to Greece in the last few days.
Yeah.
That's because Turkey and the authorities in Tripoli have penned a deal which gives with an accord over maritime waters.
Right, this is part of this proxy war extending into the waters and the resources there. This is another investigation, so I feel like I'm going to have to leave the details of this another time, but I'm going to be asking for another visa. I will get it, but there are so many complexities in this situation.
Because those maritime waters close to Crete as a result.
Yeah, it's been a desire on the part of Turkey for a while now. Turkey has been requesting the signature of the GNA for more than a year. The GNA is lucid enough to know that it's a mistake, because Turkey is alone versus Greece, Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, France in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And the fact that they ended up signing on the dotted line just a few days ago is an indication of how desperate the Tripoli government is, because it would, of course, it helps Turkey. Turkey is looking for that kind of argument in terms of its rhetoric facing the international community, and the government of Tripoli is losing a lot. So I hope Turkey is delivering a lot of weapons to justify for that huge gift that Tripoli gave it a few days ago. But it's really a realpolitik at this point.
Frederick Worry, what's in it for Turkey?
Well, as we heard, I mean, I think economic interest in terms of these offshore gas fields, in terms of, you know, cutting out its rival Greece. You know, Turkey has always had longstanding economic ties with Libya, especially, you know, with Tripoli and the western part. So again, I think Tripoli senses an economic opportunity. They've provided arms and weapons to the Tripoli government, but I think there are, you know, limits to how far Turkey will go. And as we heard, there's a real asymmetry in terms of the extent of the weaponry being provided, in terms of the Emirates and Egyptian and Russian arms far outweighing what the Turks are providing.
All right. Catherine was mentioning earlier how she's been going back and forth with France 24 to Libya since the start of the conflict. Remember, it was 2011. Muammar Gaddafi was moving in on Benghazi. The international community got together. It was France and Britain, with the U.S. not far behind, leading the charge to push him out. Back in March of 2011, when the Western-backed forces were scrambling from Benghazi in the east, Catherine was part of a previous team that traveled to Tripoli. There, Khalil Bashar sat down with Muammar Gaddafi, who alluded to past deals on keeping the migrants out.
We had a good relationship. Maybe there is a problem in terms of security in the Mediterranean, in terms of blocking immigration. There are millions of black Africans who could immigrate via the Mediterranean and head for Italy or France. And Libya plays a crucial role in the Mediterranean in terms of stopping that.
I remember that vividly, Catherine.
Oh, so do I, François.
But I remember that at the time, and we see it in your report now, this sense that, well, Gaddafi, that's a threat, right? And the sense that he'd sort of booby-trapped the country, in a sense. And you see it in your report as well, with all the weapons that are everywhere.
Right, and I mean, I think he spoke about it as well in terms of he had this deal with Italy, and he basically had this kind of arrangement with the West where I will keep a lid on this, and that's the deal. You send me money, you leave me in place. And he had it tied up anyway under a very tight fist. It's a very complex tribal picture in Libyan politics, and he controlled that and the weapons in circulation, and to a large extent, I mean, we saw it when we went down to the southern Libyan desert in the wake of the revolution, and the doors had opened, and the guys there were saying, well, you know, when Gaddafi was here, we had strict rules about who we were allowed to let in, where they went to go. Now we're dealing with it, and it's just this open tap which is coming through. So, you know, migrants have been coming into Libya for decades. There's a large migrant workforce of sub-Saharan Africans who've been working on building sites and being part of that country's economy for a long time. Some of the migrants in Libya are staying there and working on building sites for day-to-day for money to send back home. Not all of them want to cross Europe or are able or are planning to cross Europe. And there's a sense that obviously with the chaos that was unleashed by the fall, the overthrow, the killing of Gaddafi, well, it's just a free-for-all. This is part of the fallout we're seeing from that as well.
Jalal Harshawi?
No, I was just noticing the fact that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, who is deeply supported by all the European states, uses similar language. He goes to conferences and says, by the way, if you notice, the statistics of migrants from Egypt to Europe is 0, which is, to me, a threat. So the logic is really unchanged since the Gaddafi days. And if you listen to...
And in the Gaddafi days, there was a deal with Silvio Berlusconi, right?
Yeah.
With Italy to keep the migrants from crossing.
Exactly. And the same kind of dynamic exists tacitly between the current state of Egypt and Europe. And Haftar said in an interview that if Europe or Italy particularly wants the migration issue solved, they better give him something like 5 to 10 billion over a period of 10 years. It's exactly the same discourse as Gaddafi.
Frederick Worry, we're talking about putting back together a failing state or a failed state, if you will, but was it ever a state in the way that we know it, Libya?
I think the short answer is it was a very weak and fragmented political entity, and we could go back to the legacy of the Italian colonial rule. Of course, Gaddafi's own peculiar brand of governance worsened that. I mean, he really gutted the state in terms of political institutions. He ruled in a highly personalized manner. He created a kleptocracy where he empowered his family. As we heard, he played tribal favorites. You could attribute some of Libya's problems to the, I think, the mixed blessing of oil wealth in terms of the bloated, public sector. So again, we're looking at a generational problem, but I think it's important to underscore the false seduction of the strongman rule, that just the sort of nostalgia for going back to some authoritarian figure who will keep things in check, who will contain the migrants. That's not going to work. I mean, we've seen that the lid's going to blow eventually, and when it blows, it's going to be quite violent. So we should avoid that analogy.
Catherine Norris-Trent?
Yeah, when I was in Tripoli, Western Libya, people there kind of nostalgic, but without saying we want, another Gaddafi. They stopped short. A lot of people, you can easily find people who will tell you spontaneously, like, before we had work, we had peace, we weren't dying, it wasn't such a mess. But when you say to them, so you're nostalgic for the Gaddafi era, they say, no, of course not. I mean, there's this real dichotomy between wanting law and order, recognizing there were certain things that were better before, but then also saying we can never return to that. So it's
because we've seen in neighboring Tunisia people saying when things have been, and things have sometimes been chaotic since the Arab Spring, saying, oh, there's a nostalgia for going back to the Ben Ali era when there's a strong man there. But of course, recent elections prove that's not the case.
Right. So there's a nostalgia for security. There's a nostalgia for not living in a permanent state of civil war and chaos. But there's not a nostalgia, well, there may be among some people, but not a widespread one that I could find for Gaddafi himself. A lot of people say, no, obviously we did this to escape the dictatorship, but people are questioning whether it was worth it. A lot of people are questioning, given all the death and all the destruction, and the fact that now you've got Haftar, who seems to be wanting to impose another strongman model. People are saying, what was this all for?
And one final question for you, Catherine. How's Tripoli doing?
Well, it's been doing better. I mean, the toll on civilians there is quite noticeable. So obviously you've got these bombings of civilian neighbourhoods. When we were there, the garbage, the rubbish hadn't been collected for several months and was piling up by the roadside. Some of the waste disposal tips were cut off from the front line. We were told some of the refuse collectors have been fighting on the front line or weren't able to come to work. So the public health issues around that and people burning rubbish with this acrid smoke filling the air of several areas, and people who've been displaced and not able to live, sheltering in schools. And there were questions about whether schools were going to be able to reopen because you still had these displaced people. I mean, there is a toll and a fatigue of this latest war, which is really touching indeed.
All right, Catherine Norris-Trent, that report, Libya, the Infernal Trap, you can see it on our website, France24.com. It was for reporters, the France 24 investigative magazine. I want to thank Jalal Harshawi as well for being with us, Frédéric Wéry from Washington, and Tariq Argaz from Tunis. Thank you for joining us here for this special edition of the France 24 debate.